morning and welcome back to Real Estate Live UK. Our week-long programme of free-to-attend virtual events are brought to you by White Label and our partners and sponsors. We'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you to all the organisations that have contributed to our fantastic lineup this week. During 1 hour sessions, places across the UK will be showcasing their opportunities, and industry-leading experts from the public and private sectors will be discussing new ideas and current issues relating to property. You can view the entire programme of sessions on our website, realestatelive.co.uk. Right now, we're welcoming a brilliant panel who will be asking, how can the 20-minute neighbourhood help achieve carbon neutral ambitions? Our session partners are InPost UK, who we wish to thank. Before we start, I'd just like to remind you, the audience, please feel free to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A, and the panel will do their best to answer them. I'll now hand you over to our chair, Craig McLaren, Director of Scotland, Ireland and English Regions at the Royal Town Planning Institute. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Shirley. Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be chairing this session this morning. 20-minute neighbourhoods is one of these things which has really risen up the agenda recently. And I think what we really want to try and do today is try and make sure that we can start thinking about what that means. So, as I'm sure many of you know, 20-minute neighbourhoods is something which has been rising up the political agenda. I think it's based on places such as Melbourne, who've been trying to introduce it into practice. It ties in with concepts such as a 15-minute city, which have been taken forward in places like Paris as well. And it's all about ensuring that people have access to their daily needs within a 20-minute walk. It's quite a simple concept, but not often an easy one to implement in reality as well. So we've got a really good panel here today. And what I think we're going to be looking at is the fact that 20-minute neighbourhoods, that they need to make us think about how we design our cities, our towns and our neighbourhoods, how we can ensure we have the right services and infrastructure in place, and how 20-minute neighbourhoods themselves can support some of the ambitions we've got around zero carbon, around healthy places and health inequalities, and also in trying to rejuvenate our town centres as well. So we want to try and use this session to explore some of the practicalities of trying to make this happen. As Shirley said, we've got a really good range of speakers here today, and who'll all bring a probably different perspective to how a 20-minute neighbourhood should be put into place, and what the barriers are, and what the opportunities are as well. What we're going to do is each of our speakers will speak for about 3 minutes or so on their particular background to it, and we'll then open it up to Q&A. So I think one of the things we're keen the better, because that gives us the chance to build them into the discussion later on as well. So I'm going to start off with our first speaker today, Gavin Brice. Gavin is the UK Locations Director for InPost UK, and Gavin's going to give us a sort of a 3-minute perspective on what changes need to be made to local high streets and amenities to help create the 20-minute neighbourhood. Gavin, over to you.
Thank you, Craig. I think it's worth touching on lockdown as well, which, whilst extremely challenging, has provided an opportunity to adopt the positive aspects of enforced localisation to create communities where people can work, shop and play, essentially the 20-minute neighbourhood. But by definition, the 20-minute neighbourhood needs to be a place where people can meet their everyday needs within a short walk or cycle. So I think subsequently there needs to be the right infrastructure and amenities in place within the 20-minute neighbourhood to meet those needs, as well as creating the right environment to encourage walking or cycling. I think 40% of all car journeys are less than 1 or 2 miles. So services that meet a need and help create the right environment deliver on both fronts. I think TfL's electric scooter trial and prompted bike lockers are great examples of this. From an InPost perspective, online commerce home deliveries have been in exponential growth during lockdown. And I think this trend shows no signs of abating. Light good vehicle registrations were up 40% year on year. But the 20-minute community relies on this service, as not all buying needs can be met within the neighbourhood. But I guess the challenge is, how do we make that more efficient and less impactful to the 20-minute neighbourhood? And at InPost, we are working with the private and public sector to deploy a convenient network of parcel lockers, with the ultimate aim of placing a parcel lock within 500 metres walk of the UK's urban environments. But how does this help? And really the challenge and the opportunity is, by consolidating deliveries into parcel lockers, we're removing light goods vehicles from the community streets. In my sample test of one yesterday, I counted 21 couriers at my local street. And we also make a positive reduction on the 120 million missed parcel deliveries per year, which isn't surprising, as over 40% of people in central London live above the ground floor. And we make a positive impact to carbon emissions by reducing them by 2/3 when compared to home delivery. So I guess in summary, when assessing the amenities to help create a 20-minute community, meeting one of those everyday needs and improving the local environment is key to success.
Thank you, Gavin. Like that, good punchy start to how we can get on with things. Some interesting things out there already around how we should be thinking about how we change the shopping habits we have now and the way we actually do things like that. So I'm going to move on because I'm quite keen to just get the discussion out there and get people aware of what some of the issues are. So the next person we've got is Derek Wilson from TfL. And Derek's been particularly asked to talk about the role that TfL and probably other transport bodies have in helping with the 20-minute neighbourhood aspect of things. So transport's a big aspect of that. Derek, the stage is yours.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much, Craig. So I think there's a couple points to make. Obviously, transport authorities have a huge role to play in making sure that local neighborhoods are accessible and accessible to all. But I think that the role of transport authorities is often thought of as just being about transport, so providing bus services, providing underground services, a range of kind of functional transport operations. But what I don't think is often recognized is that transport authorities have a much wider role to play because they have the opportunity to create local town centers that are really accessible. They have an opportunity to create almost a polycentric city and create a network of neighborhoods that really have high levels of access, high levels of amenity, and then connect those all together. So to give you an example of Transport for London, we are currently undertaking roughly a £20 billion program of property developments around our stations. And the focus there is really to create mixed-use communities that are vibrant, that are livable, that have a mix of uses, and that have a significant component of affordability as well, so they're inclusive. So going beyond the basic transport element and actually leveraging the significant land holdings that most transport authorities have, you can actually help start to deliver high quality and walkable neighborhoods with a mix of uses, and also start improving the public and local infrastructure. So active travel, like walking and cycling, actually becomes a lot more feasible and safer and a lot more comfortable as well. So it's really about going beyond that basic operational function and actually becoming part and parcel of building the city and making it walkable and livable for everybody.
Thanks, Derek. So that's the first time I've heard polycentric. We might hear that later on, but I think that's interesting. I like the idea of trying to encourage organisations to think outside the box and think about it differently. And I think that's something we'll probably touch on during the discussion. So thanks for that. I'm going to move on to our next contributor. I've got Livia Caruso. Livia is the Public Realm Director at Hammersmith Business Improvement District. Livia, just suppose from your perspective, how is the bid using the 20-minute neighbourhood to support what it's trying to do and the projects you're trying to deliver?
Hi, Craig. Thank you very much. For the bid, it's very much about supporting behaviour change as much as anything and encouraging people to come to the town centre in different ways. So one thing we're doing quite a bit on is supporting active travel. Whether that's through, we have a regular session of Dr. Bikes, which is the bike marking and security marking. And we've also been doing increasingly more on free cycle training and tours of the town centre. So maybe people who picked up cycling during lockdown feel comfortable cycling different routes, and people who may be commuting in from further afield still feel comfortable on their journey. So we've looked at doing bike tours from a town further out coming into Hammersmith, for example, and so that people do feel comfortable along that whole route. We've also been doing free walking tours for a while now, again, to get people comfortable and familiar with their town centre and different ways they can approach it, and doing clean air walking routes so that, again, it's not a polluted route they're taking. So I think one thing that people say to us when we speak to them about their view of Hammersmith and town centre is they see it as a congested town centre, which we want to try and dispel that and help us get away from that. As part of that, we've also been we've created a 0 mile delivery service, zero emission delivery service called Parcels Not Pollution. And again, that's to help reduce the congestion in the town centre from the delivery vehicles, as you're saying, couriers. And we know that people need their deliveries, but these can come into the town centre in a more sustainable way. And that was done in partnership actually with the local council and Transport for London. So it's a mixture of these active travel measures that we're supporting, like the e-scooter training as well, which they've been introduced and they've actually taken off in Hammersmith, but we know people feel a bit apprehensive perhaps about using them. So having a lot of training and making people feel safe using them. And this behaviour change, of course, can only happen with the right infrastructure as well. So supporting infrastructure change where we can, whether that's improving existing cycle routes, providing more secure cycle parking so people can come in, and also widening streets and improving pedestrianisation so that it is more accessible for everyone. We've also been doing things on a more promotional side, perhaps, increasing events, which has been a bit of a challenge in times when obviously you can't have too many people together. So doing more outdoor events, again, at the mercy of the British weather. And we have our privilege card, which is for local offers. So again, encouraging people to come and use this town centre rather than another one, and making the most of their local area.
Thank you, Olivia. I think that's interesting. This idea of trying to animate the place and to make it an attractive place for people want to come to. And the theme of active travel is something which I think is threading through a lot of the presentations. So again, I'm sure that's something we can touch on as we move through the session. I'm going to move on to our final speaker, last but not least, Erin Byrne. Erin is the head of regeneration at Waltham Forest Council. And I suppose, Erin, I think you've been asked to come and and what you're trying to do to make that happen in your area.
Sure. So so I'm Erin Byrne. I work at Waltham Forest Council, and I guess what's interesting for me is that the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods or 15-minute neighbourhoods isn't a new concept at all. You know, I guess for any planner or urban designer, it sort of sits at the core of most modern planning theory. But I guess what's happened over the past year is that the impact of the pandemic and how people have changed their behaviour or been forced to in some cases means that actually it's people have a kind of personal lived experience now of their city and their neighbourhood, which means that this subject is becoming mainstream, which is really exciting. And it's, you know, we're at a kind of crossroads potentially. So, you know, and it's really great to see this event today because, you know, it's a really important thing for us to talk about. So I guess, I think just going back to the idea of new behaviours during the pandemic, I think a lot of people's relationship with green space, landscape and green infrastructure has changed. Whereas you might have thought it was kind of a nice to have, actually it became a kind of essential resource during lockdown, and having amenities and services closed during lockdown and the pandemic perhaps has made people value them even more. And I think, you know, in our borough, in Waltham Forest, you know, in July we had very recent flooding. So just, you know, on the subject of getting to net zero, I think climate change isn't a far off thing anymore. It's real and we're living it. So I think perhaps what's changed isn't the idea of the 15-minute neighbourhood being new, but it's a sense of urgency about having to change our cities and think differently. And perhaps it might have been a bit of an academic concept before. Now it's personal and it's impacting on people's lives every day. So I think, you know, the idea of a neighbourhood where you can meet most of your everyday needs within a short ride from your home, or having things on your doorstep, is really important, but it relies on decentralising city life. And London has actually evolved into a bit of a donut. You know, there's always been a big inequality thing between the central activity zone and central London and outer London. And actually what we found as an outer London borough, in some ways, it sounds a bit crude, but the central London's loss has been outer London's gain. And actually we've had an increase in footfall on most of our high streets and town centres over the past year. And, people have been living in a more hyper-local way. Not every job, because a lot of people still need to travel. But it's an opportunity for us to make some of those positive things permanent. And, London historically evolved as a set of walkable parishes. People were always within these, villages essentially. And it's only the impact of private car ownership and vehicle use that's kind of changed how the city is. Things are further apart, amenities are further, people live further from their families. And I think, it's about trying to untangle that. And perhaps in order to move forward, we need to look back into the past. And it's a bit of a process of undoing, as well as something new. I guess for Waltham Forest, we've got three big themes. We've got a climate change that are relevant to this. So we've got a climate change commission and, big focus on sustainable development. So making sure we're reducing the carbon footprint of our city, our borough. So that's about making compact neighbourhoods, energy efficient buildings, thinking about adaptive reuse of existing buildings, because we have a lot of older buildings that aren't performing well, minimising emissions, reducing waste, and promoting active travel, a lot of things that people have already mentioned today. But another big theme for us is affordability. So, affordable housing, because actually we need to artificially reverse the centralisation of London that has happened, that's caused an affordability crisis. And in order for people to live and work in the same place, we need to intervene and create, more affordable housing, essentially, in town centres and high streets. But I think the real core of the whole theme of, I keep saying 15-minute neighbourhoods because perhaps we're more ambitious. We think it needs to be 15 minutes, not 20 minutes. But it's walkability and addressing severance. So, when you map a neighbourhood, sometimes you can see that you're, as the crow flies, you're near a GP surgery, you're near a park, but actually the route to it can take 35 minutes or an hour. And, there are studies that show that actually 5 minutes is the tipping point for people getting in their cars. So we have to be really ambitious about addressing severance, reducing those barriers, making high quality, inclusive public realm. And in Waltham Forest, we recently completed our Enjoy Waltham Forest, which is the mini Holland programme. So it's a huge programme of cycle infrastructure that we've installed across the borough. And I think what's been interesting is actually, on one level, it enables people to cycle. But during the pandemic, the widened footways and the cycleways that we put in actually made our high streets more resilient, because businesses were able to use that extra space to have outdoor trading, or we were able to stop up pavements so that people could social distance on the street. So those sorts of public realm interventions, on the face of it, look like it's about cycle provision, but actually it's about making a resilient city. And we've seen the benefit of that on our high streets already. And just the last thing I wanted to say is that I think 15 neighbourhoods, the idea of 15 neighbourhood is an ideal. So something to work towards. It's actually about the process of making cities rather than the product itself. And it will be a continual endeavour as our needs change, as the planet changes. And I think it's really important to see it as about narrowing inequalities and social justice, making neighbourhoods that work for everyone, and community participation and getting a residents' perspective on change is a really important aspect of that. And I think also for Waltham Forest, we've been working on an evidence-based approach. So if you're looking at a new place, to map what's there and understand what's missing. So not to take a kind of generic approach to the idea of 15-minute neighbourhoods, but to understand places on their kind of specific hyper-local level, and what individual investment needs those places need.
Thanks, Erin. There's a lot of really interesting things in there. I think the idea that you've said about what's the difference between a 15-minute neighbourhood and a 20-minute neighbourhood, that's something that's come up in the chat already. For me, it's just a label. To be honest with you, it's all about trying to make sure we have much more walkable attractive places where people don't have to use their cars to go and get the things which they need on a daily basis. So I think that 15, 20-minute thing is very interchangeable. I think the other point that you've made in there is about sometimes it can be a 5-minute neighbourhood because you need to try and just make sure people can get access to those services as quickly as they can to try and make it as easy for them to do that, so they find a place in an attractive neighbourhood or town or city where they live and where they work. So we've got a number of questions coming in, but I'm going to use my chair's prerogative and start with my own. As you've said, Erin, that this isn't new in many ways. But what it does require, if it's going to be successful, is we need to think about how we can change things. And I think there's different audiences for that change. I think we need to see how our developers and the construction industry perhaps has to look at the models which they have and perhaps change what they offer and what's in there. I think we need to think about how our services are provided. And I think from a public sector service side of things, we've seen a centralisation of services, and that's probably counter to what the 20-minute neighbourhood concept's advocating. And I think there's also the idea of the fact that we need to change behaviours of individuals and see how they do it. So the 20-minute neighbourhood concept needs a lot of prodding and nudging. And I'm just wondering if you get any ideas as to what the key interventions should be or could be to try and make that happen. I'm happy for someone to put their hand in there first, or I'll start picking on you. So, does anyone want to come back on that point about change? Okay, I'm going to start picking on people now, if it's like that. Gavin, as you were first, you draw the short straw. Have you got any thoughts on how we need to try and change these behaviours and what type of tools we've got in the locker to try and do that?
So I think working from home has helped the 20-minute community. I think it will be interesting to see how it survives going back to work en masse. I think flexibility within work to work from home within your 20-minute community is key to ensuring people live and work and shop and play within a 20-minute community. I think creating spaces, what Erin and Livia said, I think the Parcels Not Pollution is a great initiative. We're creating spaces that people want to live and commute in and take their families out. And regeneration of the high street. So I think the high street had a torrid time, and it's only been worse during lockdown, but reinventing the high street as a social environment where people mix with a good high street offering that's not an egg and salad for £2.50, but is a local offer with local shops. I think one of the key things out of lockdown, particularly for me and my family, was shopping local. And finding those local retailers and grocers to get your goods and services. So supporting the high street and making sure that there's a good high street offering is key, and it's going to take planners and local councils and government to support that regeneration of the high street.
Thanks, Gavin. I'm going to move on to Derek. Derek, you talked about the idea of thinking about differently in terms of the organisation that you work for. What does that mean in terms of the different things that you can do and the different thing you need from others to try and make that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think making best use of public sector land is kind of the first piece. Various public sector authorities have huge amounts of property. TfL has 5,700 acres within London, making us one of the, I think, top 5 landowners within the capital. The big question is, how do we make best use of that, particularly around major transit nodes where there's greatest opportunity for activation, actually adding an amenity value for local neighborhoods. So that's kind of the first step. But the question is then, what do you do with it? And I think that quite often that opportunity doesn't necessarily get utilized to its full capability. The mixed use point, I think, is really, really critical because, when we talk about the 15-minute city or 20-minute neighborhood, or however we want to badge it. We often think about, do people have a local shop that they can go to? Can they get what they need on the weekends? But fundamentally, they're also going to work. And quite often we don't necessarily build in that workspace across the city. It's very much a unicentric city, London. So the question is not just how do we make it livable in the sense of you can get what you need on a day-to-day basis, but how can you actually kind of live, work, and play in your local neighborhood? So there's that element. But further to that, there's also a role to really reshape the public realm, and that's been mentioned by a number of the other panelists actually, and touched on. Having a high quality public realm that actually makes people enjoy their walk and getting around to the neighborhood and going to their local shop is absolutely essential, because they're not going to walk down a highly polluted, highly trafficked A road to get to their local shop. I mean, they'd rather be in their vehicle for that, and who can blame them? I mean, it's really about making sure that those environments are really high quality and that people actually enjoy their walk or cycle to the local amenity or their local office, so that they actually make use of that local amenity value. So it's both about creating the amenities, but also enhancing the public realm, so people actually enjoy the process of active travel.
Thanks, Derek. I think that's a really important point about safety and the feeling of safety and the feeling of enjoyment in those areas as well. Otherwise, they won't be successful. Olivia, you talked a lot about already about sort of reanimating your places and trying to change the way in which people perceived the area as well. I'm just wondering, as part of this idea of change, what are the barriers that you've been finding as part of that process? What type of help do you need from others to try and make sure that you can help with that reanimation, that reinvigoration, that rejuvenation of the places you're trying to make much more like 20-minute neighbourhoods?
Well, I think the big barrier everyone always faces is funding, of course, because we have great plans and we're kind of currently working on a public realm vision to reimagine the place and make it a lot more accessible and pleasant. But obviously there's always funding shortfalls which are needed to help. So however, some of these, I think the Mayor of London's office is very aware there's funding pots for green and resilient spaces, which I think is exactly the kind of town centres we want to have in future, green and resilient, whether that means resilience against a pandemic, a global pandemic, or the flooding that Erin referred to, because that's hit different town centres very hard as well. I think also there is the behaviour change. Obviously, as a business improvement district, we do welcome return of workers to the office where it's safe and possible to do so. So, however, people are comfortable at homes, and why would they give up a very pleasant office setup to go back to more of the old, the same kind of difficulties commuting and barriers in the office. So what we're trying to help with, and what we are seeing more of, is things like satellite offices coming up, so people can come into the office 2 or 3 days a week, make the most of that face-to-face creativity that you don't really get over Zoom. It's become a bit stale now, I think, and we just have to keep reimagining the way we work, and things like satellite offices can work. So it might seem a bit almost the opposite of a 15-minute neighbourhood, but what we're trying to do as a business improvement district as well is make it a place where people who do come into the office, who are coming from other neighbourhoods and town centres, they see that the town centre they are in, so Hammersmith in our case, as a 15-minute neighbourhood, so they can, as you say, work and play, and they can get they can go to the bank while they're here, they can go to the nice restaurant they've been wanting to try out, and they can go to a concert after work. We have the Apollo, which is a brilliant musical venue and comedy venue. So trying to give them a 15-minute neighbourhood from a 15-minute neighbourhood. So really have that across all town centres.
Thanks, Olivia. I think, again, that's really useful. I'm going to pose a similar question to Erin about opportunities and barriers. You talked about some of that earlier on, but what are the specific barriers? Well, Olivia has already mentioned resourcing, and I notice you nodding to that. I suppose that's always an issue, but is that the specific issue, or are other things or barriers which get in the way you'd like some support with?
Yeah, I think when it comes to sort of the more ambitious side of reducing barriers, like, so for example, if I can give an example, we've got a kind of growth area in Waltham Forest called Lee Bridge, and it's in the Lee Valley. So essentially it's a valley, it's got a river running through it, and the town centre has kind of evolved around the waterways. But the waterways present barriers, they need to be crossed. And we've also got a railway and a main road. So it means that the town centre is actually almost like an archipelago, it's like a set of islands that are all separate. And in other town centres where investment might be a new crossing, we're looking at bridges. Bridges are so expensive. And so actually, I think, what we're trying to do is, I think in a similar way to you, Livia, is put together a public realm framework where we can be really clear what the costs are of the interventions we need to make the area more inclusive and accessible, and then make sure that we have the evidence to be able to ask for developer contributions where we can, but also do funding applications when they come up. And I totally agree, the idea of kind of the green and resilient type funding, and the future neighbourhoods funding that the GLA recently announced. We basically, ideally we would have central government providing new funding rounds that relate to exactly this issue, because in a way our shopping list is a lot bigger than we're going to get developer contributions for. So it really does need a concerted nationwide effort to address these local issues. I think the other thing that I was going to mention, which is slightly different, is about behaviour change. And a lot of the focus with behaviour change is often with residents for councils. But we also have been doing a lot of work with businesses, because, for example, we have realised that a lot of the high street businesses in Waltham Forest and probably across London, they actually have, even though they may be independent themselves, and we'd be encouraging people to support them as local businesses, their supply chains could be completely enormous, and they will have deliveries coming from across the country, and also their staff may be travelling quite far. And actually what we found is that a lot of the parking requirements in town centres, sorry to get onto parking, but aren't necessarily for visitors. It's often staff of businesses. So actually, businesses need a lot of support. High street businesses need a lot of support in modernising and thinking about themselves using active transport. But it is also down to affordability. And owners of small businesses often have to live quite far away from where they work. So again, that brings in this idea of affordable housing as well, and needing to make sure that it's affordable to be able to live and work in the same place.
That point you make, Karen, about almost making the case and trying to change behaviours. That there's a question in the chat box about the work you've done in trying to identify the degree to which centres perform the role of that neighbourhood hub. And I'm just wondering, as part of that, is evidence and building an evidence base a really important part of this, and also for perhaps getting funding it as well, I would imagine? And how much effort and time have you put into that?
Well, I think we're in the process of working out what evidence we need, but I think what we're aware of is that each town centre is very different, each area, each neighbourhood, and they're all facing different issues. So one might be performing well in terms of has loads of parks and access to open space, but then doesn't have the social infrastructure to support the growth in population that we're experiencing. So we're just actually in the process of launching a pilot where we will be over the next year commissioning an evidence base, looking at some case study town centres within Waltham Forest, rather than doing a kind of blanket review of the whole of Waltham Forest, which would probably take as long as it would to write our local plan, which it would take years. So we're just starting by looking at individual places and then building up a methodology that we could apply across the borough. And we are starting with Lee Bridge, which I mentioned already, as being one of the areas that has the highest growth in terms of new homes planned for the future, but at the same time experiences this issue of severance. So it's about trying, and I think the evidence is also about, like I mentioned before, councils and bids and organisations putting together strategies and plans for what projects need to be done in order to improve the public realm, so that we then have the evidence to be able to then apply for funding or get developer contributions. Great,
thanks. That's useful. I'm going to move on to, there's a really interesting question in the chat box about something I was wanting to raise anyway from Marcus Wilshire. So thanks, Marcus. And this question, his question and his point is that making walkable neighbourhoods is actually quite an easy thing to do in places like London. But what about the towns and other areas where there's a car dependency already hardwired into the development? How do we do that? How do we almost retrofit it? How do we change things? And I'm going to change the order. I'm going to ask Derek first for your views on that from almost a transport perspective. What are the type of things we can do to almost retrofit the 20-minute neighbourhood to some of these more difficult places rather than sort of start from scratch?
Yeah, that's it's a really tough one. I mean, I think in the first instance we need to look at policy. If we're hardwiring in a car-based transport system through the planning process, you're going to be dealing with issues perpetually. And as always, trying to retrofit and address issues is a lot more difficult than trying to avoid them in the first place. So, in the first instance, the objective really should be to try and avoid having that car dependency hardwired into those developments. Now, of course, that's not always feasible, and it does take time to get policy in place, and things are going to progress in the meantime. So the question then becomes, how do you actually tackle these issues? The key, I think, is first of all trying to get a robust transport network in place. And when I say that, I don't mean operational transport networks necessarily. I also include active travel amongst that. So walking and cycling are very, very key. A lot of these neighborhoods I do appreciate are going to be potentially quite far distances between amenities and where people are living. So cycling is definitely something that should probably be prioritized. One of the other things actually that is really worth focusing on is, even if you do have car dependency, making sure that development is in some respects mixed use, so that a new housing development has a retail shop at the ground floor. That actually helps mitigate a lot of the issues, because even if a resident does have a car park where they have their own personal vehicle, if they've got a shop downstairs, they're not going to go use it. So having that mixed use amenity throughout all developments is another way to deal with it. And ultimately, once you start getting that policy in place and get that infrastructure in place, you can actually start looking at redeveloping car parks to some degree. Whether or not that's taking a ground level car park that's underneath the development and retrofitting that for commercial units, or potentially an office space, or taking an open air car park and developing a new project above it. Making use of that car parking space once you've got the infrastructure to enable a more livable town center is something that should definitely be looked at, because ultimately, if there isn't a car park, people aren't going to be using it. So trying to drive that behavior shift a little bit more by force, but also making sure you have the enablers to make that feasible and non-disruptive. You've got to kind of tackle it on both fronts.
That's really interesting idea about the reusing of car parks and things like that. Olivia, have you got any views on that? I know you're based in London, but are there other areas you know of, or any other interventions or ideas you know of which can help with these harder to fix areas?
Yeah, well, I think it is a kind of historic problem, because in the past, we have created out of town shopping centres and things, so people would get their cars and things like that. So they've been specially created. I think it's a big challenge, but obviously I think Derek raised some great solutions there, and thinking about introducing different solutions right at the source, so utilising those spaces as well, so that it is a one-stop shop, as you say, and even if the car journey is made, it's one rather than 5 multiple ones. I think we've seen lots of really interesting things in terms of delivery. We're talking about delivery and courier services as well. So that's maybe introducing more of those in harder to reach places, and things like electric cargo bikes. And we've even seen kind of pedestrian, so like walkable delivery, so people going to deliver things. So maybe that can create new jobs as well if we have more of these active deliveries to harder to reach places, or for people who maybe need their cars for who could be disabled or just have mobility problems. I think also I saw a question, sorry, I'm adding to changing the conversation slightly, but about the culture and how we bring culture to 20-minute neighbourhoods as well. And I think it's really important to have that as a kind of key piece. And again, so we could introduce that in these outer town centres or harder to reach places, so it becomes a day out almost. So it's, again, that 20-minute neighbourhood, but maybe not on your doorstep, but you can travel there and it has everything you need in one place. I think that would be one way around it. And it has, doctors, cinemas and shops, retail, everything there, but in a outer location.
So in some ways that's trying to develop a hierarchy of settlements as well, where you can get those daily needs locally, the other things you need to get to need a longer journey, I anticipate. So yeah, that's a question which is often asked, certainly with me based in Scotland, about how this works in a rural area, and that's what we talk about. This hierarchy might be a way of looking at it. Gavin, I'm going to bring you in on the back of Olivia's point about deliveries as well, and any thoughts you've got on some of those places which have been built not with the 20-minute concept in mind, but any thoughts on how you can try and reverse some of that idea?
Well, I've actually got personal experience of moving from Kingston upon Thames, which is very well supplied with transport, to Ilfracombe in North Devon this June. So I've gone from a major city in the UK to a regional town. And there's so much more that the regional towns can do to encourage that everything's within a 20-minute cycle ride, albeit it's very steep. But the car park in Ilfracombe is positioned at the end of the harbour, which means everybody has to drive through the town to park at the end of the town, to walk back away from the town, the car park, to get back to the high street. So the design is crippling, and making use of that car park into an event space and putting a shuttle service into town would be much better. But in terms of parcel deliveries and lockers, I think people in regional towns are even more reliant on online shopping, because the shops aren't there to meet the need. And parcel lockers can play a role in that, in the regional towns, to placemate basically in the high street. Our research with 2 of the major supermarkets show that people using lockers go on to do something else. Almost half of them go on to make a purchase locally. So attracting people back to the high street for their parcel needs, whether that be returning or sending or collecting a parcel, inevitably they go on and do something else in the high street. So lockers not only reducing delivery goods vehicle frequency on the roads, but acting as a placemaker in combination with regenerating the high street.
Thanks, Gavin. That again, that's really useful and very interesting. I'm going to ask you, Aaron, from your experience both in Waltham Forest and perhaps elsewhere, have you any thoughts or ideas on how we can do this retrofit on these areas which weren't built with the 20-minute neighbourhood in mind?
Well, I think, I agree with what Derek was saying about it is to do with policy. And, I think in a way there needs to be a sort of, a town centre first approach where, if there's a considerably sized new development with a lot of new housing, it really needs to be located within a 20-minute distance of a high street town centre and amenities. And if it really can't be, if it's a new settlement or it's an extension of a town or it's a new town essentially, then it needs to be accompanied with strategic transport investment. It can't be housing first, infrastructure later. And I think, you know, that's got to be the key message. And, you know, at the moment, there's a big pressure on councils to deliver housing for, you know, genuine reasons. You know, we've got incredible need, but sometimes it can be that, you know, housing led. And I think, again, what Derek was saying about mixed use development is really important. And it's about, you know, schemes over a certain size, making sure that they are delivering the amenities that those residents need to avoid them jumping in their cars. But I think, yeah, it's just really important that new development that is out of town is accompanied by strategic transport investment, because otherwise we're going to be creating very isolated communities that will end up with health issues, social deprivation, all of the issues that we're just putting the issues off into the future, essentially. And it's a short-sighted approach to planning. But I think if you look at places like Cambridge and you look at like the Northwest Cambridge Master Plan urban extension, you know, that was all about cycle connectivity. Obviously, Cambridge benefits from being quite flat. And so they model themselves on the Dutch approach, you know, which is that there's no excuse to not get on a bike really, or to use wheeled transport that's not motorized. But I think that's a really important thing. And I think even in hilly places like Ilfracombe or where I live in Kent, I think it's also about making it as easy as possible for people. So again, it's this idea of removing barriers. And I think in the public sector, it's about trying to design a public realm where it's almost impossible not to get on your bike or to walk. I know that sounds like a strange concept, but you know, it's like making sure, for example, if you're designing a new development, what are the desire lines out of it? And start with that. Don't put all the buildings in the way. I mean, that annoys me big time. Like, and it's so common, isn't it, that you can't wayfind, you can't find your way out, you jump in your car. Like, it's the more barriers we put in people's way, the easier it is for people to jump in cars. And people's time is precious. And you know, I think it's about designing with empathy and trying to basically make it as easy as possible to behave in a way that's green, rather than putting the onus on the individual for them and then making them feel guilty about driving, when actually it's like everything has been designed in a way where there's no other choice.
Is that almost a people in place first approach, rather than the other way around, which is tended to be practiced, to be honest with you? Okay, well, we've actually got a limited amount of time left, and I'm just going to ask a final question, if you could perhaps answer it quite succinctly. And it goes back to the title of the session, and just really want to know is that from each of you, how important you think the whole 20-minute neighbourhood, 15-minute neighbourhood concept is in achieving net zero at a local level. Is that a key driver behind? I'm going to start with you, Olivia, if you could give us your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think it's extremely important. I think behaviour change starting on a local level will be more beneficial in the long run for everyone. What we do can impact the choices we make in future. So I think it's really important also for things like health. Having more active travellers is beneficial for everyone. So I think it's really integral. And as we said, I think there's a lot of, it's a good time to do this. There's a lot of will to make things happen. So I think it's great to capitalise on that and get that ball rolling. And as you say, it's been spoken about for a while, but maybe the either political will or people didn't realise the need for it. Whereas now, as you said, the urgency is clear. And so we need to start working on that.
Great. Thank you. Erin, your thoughts?
I mean, just to kind of mirror what Olivia was saying, I think, you know, we're at a crossroads, and people have already started to change their behaviour, perhaps because of what's happened over the last year or two. So, I think it's the perfect time to act, basically, because of this sense of urgency and this sense of sort of renewed interest in people living locally. I think it's also, it's clear to me the relationship between 15-minute neighbourhoods and climate change, and creating green and resilient town centres and neighbourhoods is absolutely the key. And there's lots of ways of doing that we've talked about it. But I think it's also about thinking about the economic value of it, because it's proven that people spend more time and shop more on green high streets. And it sounds really crude, but the trees aren't just there for the birds. It's like they have a cooling effect. They make it more attractive. There's a completely different experience of being on a high street with no trees and on a high street with trees. I know that sounds very crude, and I think what we haven't really captured is the economic impact of that as well. And I think there's a value that comes, which is beyond just the role of green infrastructure and making, and I think that idea of resilience is social, environmental, and economic. And I think the only way that this whole narrative around 15-minute neighbourhoods will stick is, I think, if we understand that better.
Thanks for that. The idea of the sticky street thing in the green street and trying to get people to stay in places is yes, incredibly important. So thanks for that. Derek, I saw you nodding away there when Erin was speaking, agreeing with much of what she said. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how important 20-minute neighbourhoods are to trying to achieve those or match those zero carbon targets, which we're all thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the numbers as to where our carbon emissions come from, commuter traffic obviously is a significant component. It's by no means the only component. And when you look at other areas like, for example, the need to retrofit existing homes, to some degree, the 15-minute city doesn't necessarily move the dial that significantly when you compare it to these other issues. So I take a slightly different view in that from a net zero carbon perspective. Is it important? Of course it is, because every bit helps. But relatively speaking, the impact is small, which isn't to say that it isn't important. However, what I do think is really, really critical is the point about economic, social, and environmental well-being, really, and performance. The 15-minute city is absolutely critical to people's health. It's critical to the economic vitality and resilience of our cities. There's a whole range of economic, social, and environmental benefits that come from that model. And I think that when we're talking about this issue, yes, it contributes to net zero carbon, but the benefits that it has are much, much, much wider and are worth pursuing in their own right. So yeah, I think it's absolutely essential to, a resilient, environmentally sustainable, economically prosperous country and city and town centers. So yeah, no, it's essential for a multitude of reasons.
So it is important for zero carbon, but it's also important for lots of other things as well. Your social and your economic. So I think that's a key message and a strong message which is coming through, which I think is always useful, and again in pushing this to politicians and to funders and influencers as well. So Gavin, your thoughts on whether the 20-minute neighbourhood does have an important role to play in terms of zero carbon?
So I echo what my other panelists have said. Absolutely, it does. But I'm a great believer in the health aspect of active travel and getting people outdoors, not just for physical health, but for mental health. I think cities can be quite a lonely place to live for a lot of people. And to ground yourself within your 15-minute neighborhood and get a sense of being part of a 15-minute community helps that aspect and drives investment into the quality of the immediate place within which you live. So I think mental health, physical health, and of course net carbon zero, particularly in towns and cities that aren't blessed with efficient transport systems that like TfL provide, in London, and there's greater car dependency.
Great. Well, thank you all. That's me stop grilling you. You'll be glad to know. So, but thanks for that. I think that's been a really good discussion. From my perspective, a lot of this has been really useful and really interesting. It made me think about, I think, particularly around the need to change. We've talked a lot about changing behaviours, and particularly in terms of how we all as individuals interact with our places and our cities, and what we need to do to try and nudge those behaviour changes as well, and make it more attractive to make those changes, make it easier as well. There's a bit about changing some of the models which we have, how we develop, how the planning system works, how the processes and systems work as well, perhaps embedding place and people much more up front and more front-loaded way into systems. So we have the 20-minute, 15-minute neighbourhood concept embedded from the very, very start. And it's probably a bit about changing priorities, and that probably touches on a national level about what the policy is and how you can have that policy context which allows you to make that change happen, which is required. So thanks to you all for your contributions. It's been an interesting session. I'd like to thank the audience as well, because we have had a number of questions coming in. I've tried to sort of bring them in, not maybe directly as questions, but as part of the conversation discussion. I know the panelists have tried to do that as well. So thanks for that. It shows us an interest. It's made my job easy. If there's lots of people with lots of questions and ideas and lots of things to say, I'm not having to sit here making things up. So thanks you all for that. So as I say, that's been really interesting. I think there's a lot of food for thought in it, and something we can take away. So I'm just going to pass back to Shelley, who's going to give you a bit more about the broader aspects within the broader session. So Shelley, over to you.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you to all our panellists today for a great discussion. Thank you also to our sponsor, InPost UK. We hope you, the audience, enjoyed this session. Looking ahead for today, next up we should have some slides showing what's on today for the rest of Tuesday. Next up, we've got a session in partnership with Building Garden Communities. So starting now, a discussion around stewardship and the role it has in creating cohesive garden communities. We also invite you to sign up to a wellbeing break at 12:25 today. It's something that's brought to us by Real Estate Live's wellbeing partner, Therma Group. So this is a short session, a 15-minute session, a perfect way to end a busy morning. If you've been desk-bound, you can learn some stretching and postural relief techniques. Thank you again for joining us this morning, everybody, and we hope to see you soon.